there are 4 candidates running for Supreme Court. Those candidates, one we heard last week, and now we'll hear from Judge Ron Lewis, who is our candidate for Supreme Court. Ron Lewis.
Thank you. How about a big round of applause for Shannon for putting these together? These are great. Well, my name is Ron Lewis, and I'm running for Ohio Supreme Court. First, let me tell you just a little bit about myself. I graduated from law school in 1993. I met my wife in law school. She was a year ahead of me. She was my peer advisor. I like to say she took advantage of me in a moment of weakness, but she has a much different opinion about how that happened. We have 4 children. My oldest is a prosecutor in Greene County. My oldest son is a postal worker in Cincinnati. My middle son is a commodities broker for Cargill, and my youngest is working on his master's at Miami in sustainable agriculture. So that's my family. I'm very fortunate. I live on the family farm that I grew up on. I still farm. We no longer farm any grain, but I've got pigs, I've got chicken, and I've got cows. I said chicken. I've got chickens. Nobody has a chicken. But I've got chickens, I've got steers, and I've got pigs, and in the spring we'll have sheep. So I was very fortunate to grow up on that farm. I was very fortunate to raise my family on that farm, and those values have stuck with me my entire life. My dad he's the 3rd generation to run a construction company that our family owned, mostly pipeline construction. So I had probably been a lawyer for a good 10 years before I'd spent more time behind a desk than I had in either a field or a ditch. So I know what hard work is all about. I've done it. I continue to do it. I've transferred that over into my professional career, my professional life as well. Very fortunate professionally. I was a prosecutor for 19 years. In addition to being a prosecutor for 15 of those years, I was also a law director. So I've had a lot of experience both in the criminal arena and the civil arena. I was in private practice before I went to become a prosecutor for about 5 years. Both of my partners became common pleas court judges. So I do feel like I have a very good background in the law. I was elected to a trial court. I was a trial court judge. And then in 22, I was appointed and elected to the 2nd District Court of Appeals, which is located in Dayton. But we have the counties of Champaign County, which is Urbana, Clark County, which is Springfield, Greene County, where I live, county seat is Xenia, Montgomery County, which is the city of Dayton, Miami County, which is Troy, and I have Greenville, which is in Darke County. So district is very rural and very urban at the same time. Very fortunate to represent that district. We now have 5 very, very conservative judges on that bench. It is 100% different than when I first started practicing 30-some years ago, where we had 5 very liberal judges on that bench. So it's taken a lot of hard work and a lot of organization by the local parties and a lot of hard work and dedicated folks to make that happen. Now, my judicial philosophy as a judge is I'm what's called an originalist. What does that mean? It means that I look at a law, how it was written, what it meant, when it was written. Not what words might mean 40 years later, 100 years later, what they meant at the time it was written. I think it's very important that judges are very predictable, follow the law. It's not a judge's responsibility or right to rewrite the law. You get into nothing but trouble when that happens. You might like it one day when I bend the law in your favor. You're certainly not going to like it another time when I bend it in the other guy's favor. So, according to the Ohio Department of Commerce, one of the things that businesses look at when they decide to move to the state of Ohio or any state is the judicial and legal climate. And in Ohio, we've been very fortunate for an extended period of time to have a very stable judicial environment. People don't necessarily want you to be pro this or con that. They just want you to follow the law. And if the law is not right, then they'll go to a state representative or a state senator, and they need to get it changed that way, not through the judge. So I'm an absolute originalist. Why should you take my word on that? Well, I have a record. You can more than look up my record. You can look at the cases I've settled, the cases I've sat on, and I can give you a couple of very good, quick examples. There was an individual in my court a couple years ago who, after 30-some years, decided he was no longer a man, that he was a woman, and he went to a probate court in Clark County to try to get his sex marker on his birth certificate changed. The statute that he was using was never intended for that purpose, so the decision was appealed. The statute was drafted for when an individual is born and a doctor makes, or whoever the reporting official makes a mistake on that birth certificate, they can go back and correct it. So in other words, a couple days after you're born, you get the birth certificate and you realize, my baby is not Asian, he's actually African American. Or my baby doesn't have brown hair, he's got red hair. Or blue eyes or whatever. That's what it was meant to do. It wasn't meant for 30-some years later for somebody to go and have their sex marker changed. That case was appealed to the Ohio Supreme Court, and there was not a plurality decision with the Ohio Supreme Court. So the majority agreed that that wasn't the right statute, but they agreed for different reasons. So my opinion is currently the law in the state of Ohio. Another example, there was a very brutal rape by a student at the University of Dayton. And it was a stranger, came off the street. She was asleep on her couch in the living room watching TV where the attack occurred. She went in and applied for what is called a sexually oriented protection order, okay? The judge in her case denied the protection order because he said she wasn't in any present danger because he's in jail awaiting trial. That is not an element of the statute. That is something that judge created. I overruled that judge. That case was appealed, went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court upheld that decision. So those are just two examples, and I can give you many of what it means to be an originalist. Follow the law as written, follow the intent at the time it was written, and you become what's called a very boring and predictable judge. But you want your judges to be very boring and predictable. So when I was on a trial court bench and when I was a prosecutor, I had a reputation for being very fair but very firm. I always considered community safety. That was always at the top of any decision I made. And it should always be at the top of any decision a judge makes. I can give you a prime example of why who you select to be your Supreme Court justices can affect you and why it's important. We had a prior Chief Justice who decided that when deciding whether an individual gets bail or doesn't get bail, community safety and standards should not be considered. Thankfully, the legislature came in, rewrote the law, essentially overturned our prior Chief Justice. So it does matter who's on that court. A lot of people don't really ever have any interaction with the courts, and that's a good thing. The best thing that ever comes out of a court is an adoption. Other than that, everything else is pretty much controversial in some way. So the fact that you may not know the courts and don't know how they impact your daily lives, that's not a bad thing, but they do impact your daily lives. I'll give you a prime example. My son, who lives in Cincinnati, just bought a house in Newport, Kentucky, right across the river. It's literally on the river. He went to get car insurance. His car insurance went up 300% just by crossing that river. And there's a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is they have a very, very bad case law. They have very bad precedent in the insurance industry. And that shows you, it's just one simple example how bad court decisions can affect your everyday life. They can get in your pocket, and it can affect your standard of living. You know, the county prosecutor or a prosecutor, I always say, determines and establishes what the standard of living you're going to have in your county. They're the ones that kind of determine what cases they're going to take, how they're going to handle those cases. But those cases ultimately go to a judge. And it's really important the judges that you pick, both on the trial court level, the Court of Appeals, and certainly the Supreme Court. The simple truth is, in Ohio, about 98 to 99% of all cases that are appealed, they never go to the Supreme Court. It's only about 1% of cases that make it to the Supreme Court. So if it's only 1% of those cases that make it to the Supreme Court, why would I ever want to leave the Court of Appeals? Because that 1% of the cases has statewide impact. And it affects and determines the standard of living for all the citizens in the state of Ohio. You know, when you select a judge, in a lot of ways, you're taking a leap of faith because judicial offices are 6 years. They're the only office in the state of Ohio that lasts 6 years. So if you elect a bad judge, you've got a bad judge for the next 6 years. You elect a bad state rep, you've got him for 2 years. It's really different. So you're almost like taking a leap of faith when you make that decision. I think I help you take that leap of faith a lot easier based upon my judicial record, based upon my work history, based upon my family history. Now, I've been a Republican my entire life. I'm not new to the Republican Party. I first started working in Republican races in 1976. I've managed state house races, I've managed local county races, I've managed congressional races. I've worked on 3 statewide races. I grew up, I didn't have a choice whether to be a Republican or not in the house I grew up in. My mother was our county chairwoman for about 20-some years, and she was on state central committee for most of those years as well. So it was kind of born and bred into me, and thank God it was. There's only one justice left currently on the Ohio Supreme Court, Justice Bruner, who's a Democrat. So why is this race so important if there's only one justice left? Well, I can tell you why. One example would be that first case I told you about, N. Ray Adeline, the person that wanted to change their sex marker. Justice Bruner was the only person that truly dissented on that case. That's just a prime example of her train of thought and where her mind is coming from and how she's thinking. It wasn't that many years ago that the court was the other way. It just doesn't take that many election cycles for the court to swing back in the control of the Democrats. Every one of those seats is vitally important, every one of them. We're very fortunate right now with the current Supreme Court we have in the state of Ohio. We've got a great group of people led by Justice Kennedy, and she does a fantastic job. We're very, very fortunate. But I agree. But I want to make sure, I want to keep that record going in that direction. So I ask that if you take that leap of faith with me, you put your trust in me, because that's what I'm asking you to do, is put your trust in me when you cast that ballot and you vote for me for your next Ohio Supreme Court Justice. Now, I have been going around the state of Ohio since last February. I think this is my second time here to this particular meeting. I love the state of Ohio. I know how hard these statewide races are because I've worked on them before. I know how much time it takes. I know how much money it takes. I know how hard it is to win. I have put together a fantastic campaign team. I could not have a better campaign team. My campaign manager is a gentleman by the name of Cameron Sadgister. Used to be executive director of the Ohio Republican Party. He's absolutely brilliant, and I got to give him so much credit in the success we've had to this point. I've got a gentleman by Blake McNamara, who's my chief fundraiser. Again, he raises money for John Husted. He's raised money for a lot of different people, but I feel very comfortable where we are right now in the campaign. It takes a lot of hard work. We're putting a lot of that hard work in, and hopefully we'll see the fruits of our labor. I'd be happy to answer anybody's question about absolutely any topic, except maybe my weight. Anything other than that, we're good to go.
Great. Ron, thank you so much. I'm going to ask the first question, and before this one comes up, one of the questions I always like to ask judicial candidates, because it's not something that we all hear talk about. You talked about your experience running campaigns, being involved as a volunteer in a campaign, putting up yard signs, going and working in the headquarters. What is your plan? How are you going to go and reach the 800,000 or 700,000 primary voters in Ohio? How are you going to reach them? What's your plan to actually get that vote? What's going to make you distinct from the other three candidates in the race?
Well, this race will be a little bit different than what Ohioans are used to. We have not had a primary in the Supreme Court race since Justice Fisher ran ever so many years ago. So Ohio is not really accustomed to there being a primary race in a Supreme Court. It takes a lot of money to run these races. There's only a limited amount of money to raise for this particular race. So this primary, it's my guess, and my educated guess, will look a lot differently than it will in the fall. Most people are going to be probably limited to somewhere under $500,000 to spend in the primary, which means you're going to have limited TV coverage, which means you're going to rely heavily upon direct mail and radio and going around to, if there's 3 people meeting, I'm going to be there. And I learned that from Justice Kennedy. There was nowhere that nobody outworked her ever, and no one's going to outwork me. So I'm doing a lot of the face-to-face. I'm going around and meeting as many people as I can. I realize that you're not going to meet 800,000 people, but those things compound. And the more people you meet, the more people talk, and that's what we need everybody to do, to talk about these races. Everybody needs to get out and vote, not just this race, but let's face it, Republicans are bad off-year they don't go and vote. They just don't. And it's important to me that you vote. It's important to the country you vote, because we don't want to lose the House of Representatives. So I guess getting out the vote, direct mail, radio, and if we have enough money, TV.
I'm a constituent here in Strongsville, and the question is, Minnesota, the whole church protest, what's your stance kind of on that from a legal point of view?
Well, I think everybody under the First Amendment has a right to worship, and I think that their right was interfered with. Right now, the Justice Department is looking at that case. The federal laws are a lot different than the state laws, and in a lot of ways are more difficult to prove intent. But under Ohio law, if I was a prosecutor, I certainly would look at charging them with obstructing official business and disorderly conduct. There's lots of different things you could look at charging them with. They were asked to leave by the pastor, at least the video I saw, early on, and they continued to stay. Once you're asked to leave private property and you continue to stay, you're now criminally trespassing. So there's a lot of different offenses somebody that chooses to behave in that manner could be charged with. Ultimately, the standards that the folks in Minnesota decide to apply are probably going to be a lot different than the ones we would apply here in Ohio. So that's kind of what we're looking at.
As an Ohio Supreme Court Justice, what would be your number one issue that you would not cave in on for any reason?
Well, I don't know that I would cave in on anything, to be honest with you. I don't think I've ever caved in on anything my entire life. There's a lot of issues that are really important to me, but I leave those at the door. I try to leave my personal opinions at the door. I think that's what a judge is supposed to do. If there's bad laws, you're going to get bad decisions. It's that simple. I think Justice Scalia said one time he may not always agree with some of the decisions he writes, but he can promise you they're the law. And that's kind of my opinion. I'm not a caver.
All right, Ron, you're not ready for this one.
I'm ready.
What is your favorite canon of construction excluding the doctrine of absurdity?
I'm not ready for that one. Next question. I like it, though.
All right, great. Thank you, everyone.
Hey,
Ron
thanks,
Lewis
thank you.
for Supreme Court. Thank you. Appreciate it.